Welcome. Tonight we'll be exploring how people survived the coldest winters of the medieval world, from strange sleep habits to how they stayed warm without modern heat. If you enjoy slow, calming history to fall asleep to, be sure to like, subscribe, and comment what you'd like to hear next. Now let's begin. Before central heating, insulation, or fleece blankets, there was winter. Medieval winter didn't arrive with much warning. No forecasts, no alerts, just the wind turning sharp, the days shrinking short, and the slow creeping arrival of deep cold. Most people in Europe lived in one-room homes, walls made of timber and daubed mud. No glass windows, just wooden shutters, gaps in the wood. Cold air always found a way in. The hearth in the center of the room burned low through the night. Wood was precious. It wasn't easy to cut or carry, and much of it was saved for cooking, so at night the fire dimmed, the air grew still, and people slept wrapped in layers of wool, straw, and sometimes even hay. Clothing wasn't changed often in the winter, it was layered, sometimes never removed. Underwear was linen, if you were lucky. Then came wool, thick tunics, cloaks, wraps. Peasants wore cloaks lined with fur if they could afford it, rabbit, squirrel, or cat. Yes, cat fur was used, warm and available. Socks were made of cloth or felted wool. Some tied scraps around their legs like makeshift gaiters. And to sleep, they wore everything. There was no such thing as bedtime pajamas, just daytime clothes, worn until spring. Beds were rare. If you were a peasant, you slept on a straw mattress, maybe raised on a wooden frame, but often just on the floor. Straw attracted bugs, mice, and worse, it had to be changed out when it began to rot or smell. Families slept together, especially in winter, for warmth, yes, but also for protection. There are records of people sleeping next to livestock inside the home, chickens, goats, even cows. The animals gave off body heat, and in the deepest winters, that warmth meant survival. Sleep wasn't a single stretch either. People had what's called segmented sleep, 2 shorter chunks of sleep, with an hour or 2 of wakefulness in between. They'd wake up in the middle of the night and pray, or tend the fire, or even talk quietly in the dark. It wasn't considered strange. It was just how sleep worked before electricity. Between the 14th and 19th centuries, Europe went through what historians call the Little Ice Age. Winters got colder, summers got shorter, frost came early, crops failed, and famine followed. In some villages, people built windbreak trenches, shallow ditches to stop icy wind from slamming into their homes. Others piled snow around the outside of their walls, not to remove it, but to insulate. In Iceland, where winter could be especially brutal, people built turf houses. Thick layers of earth and grass were stacked to make walls. The structure was buried in the land itself. It kept the cold out, and the warmth trapped inside. In the coldest months, the church became more than a place of worship. It was a gathering hall, a shelter, a place to warm the soul when the body had no fire left. Even the smallest villages had a wooden chapel, often unheated, drafty, and dimly lit by tallow candles that barely pushed back the shadows. But it was a place to gather, to sit shoulder to shoulder, to hear something besides the wind howling through the trees. Church bells in winter sounded different, more hollow, more distant, like they were ringing underwater. Some villagers believed the snow itself muffled the sound as a form of divine silence, a kind of sacred hush laid over the earth. Services were shorter in winter, not out of mercy, but necessity. Fingers grew numb, breath froze in the air. But still, they came, wrapped in wool and fur, dragging tired children and creaking bones through frost and slush. Because missing Mass wasn't just frowned upon, it was feared. To skip the holy gathering in the dark of winter was to invite darkness into the home. There were traditions only kept during the cold season. The reading of St. Blaise's blessing, meant to protect the throat from illness. The lighting of Candlemas tapers, long, blessed candles saved to burn during storms or childbirths. These little rituals gave people comfort, not warmth perhaps, but something close. And in some parishes, on the longest night of the year, the priest would allow the congregation to sleep inside the church. Not for worship, but simply because it was the most windproof building in the village. They would huddle together, old women with their rosaries, young boys curled beside wooden pews, and above them, cold stone arches and a wooden crucifix looming in the flickering candlelight. There was an unspoken understanding that winter brought everyone lower, even the proud, even the pious, and for one night, sleep in the church was not a scandal, it was survival. In larger towns, the cathedral choir sang differently in winter. Notes lingered longer. The reverb of stone walls caught every voice and held it like breath in a frozen field. People wept during winter hymns, not always out of faith, but because the music reminded them of warmth. In some villages, there was a midwinter procession. Lanterns, bells, a statue of a saint carried through the snow. Children scattered dried herbs. The faithful walked in silence. And once the walk ended, they returned to their homes, their fires, their cracked bowls and damp cloaks. But something small had changed, because for one night they felt not alone, but together in the cold, a kind of shared stillness, a pause in the deep breath of the season. Most food storage happened in autumn. Grains were dried, beans were packed away. Meat was salted or smoked if you had the setup. Fish was preserved in brine. Cheese was hard and aged, made to last for months. But by February, things were running low. The cellar that once held full sacks was quiet. The shelves looked bare. The salted meat had turned sour. The bread was hard or completely gone. Peasants made pottage, a thick, simple stew made from whatever was left. Cabbage, onion, barley if they had it. Stale bread was soaked and stirred into the mix. Sometimes it cooked for days, adding water each time it got low. It became darker, thicker, and more bitter over time, but it was warm, and it filled the stomach. Some villagers added crushed bones into broth, boiling them long after the meat was gone. Bone broth was rich in fat, and when the body is cold, it needs fat, not just for survival, but for energy. In wealthier homes, winter food was still bleak, but more varied. They had pickled vegetables, dried fruits, and preserved jams. Spices like cloves and cinnamon were used to flavor old meat or flat ale. But spices were expensive and often locked away in small boxes, too precious to waste. So the poor made do with bitter roots and cold porridge. To drink, most people avoided water. It was considered unsafe, and often was. Instead, they drank ale, weak but boiled during brewing. Even children drank it. It was called small beer, just enough alcohol to kill germs, but not enough to make you drunk. On special days, they made wassail, a spiced ale or cider served warm, often in celebration or ritual. It was a way to lift spirits, to make midwinter feel festive, even in the cold and dark. To keep warm, people used whatever they could: wool cloaks, straw mats, hot stones wrapped in cloth. Some even slept with warmed bricks near their feet, if they were lucky enough to own bricks. There are records of people wrapping themselves in animal skins, not just as coats, but as bedding. Sheepskin in particular was prized. It kept heat in, and it was soft. Goatskin worked too, but it smelled strongly. There was also a belief in hot ale for the blood, not just a comfort drink, but a genuine belief that warm liquid would heat the humors and protect against cold-related illness. In some regions, old women made warming charms, pieces of cloth tied with herbs and worn under clothing, rosemary, sage, garlic. They were sewn shut, believed to bring warmth and ward off sickness. People also feared the air itself. Cold air was considered bad air, a bringer of disease. So some homes burned bundles of herbs or incense, not to mask smells, but to purify the air. They believed sickness floated in through the cold drafts. Superstition and survival often went hand in hand. A common winter protection was the hagstone, a rock with a natural hole through it hung above doors, said to ward off witches and winter spirits, and keep warmth from being stolen during the night. In other villages, families placed iron near the hearth, a knife, a nail, anything made of metal. It was thought to keep the fire spirit inside the home, preventing it from being lured out. Sometimes people left small pieces of bread or salt on their doorstep at night, an offering. If the spirits were cold and hungry, they might pass by peacefully. If not, they could whisper sickness through the walls. When the nights stretched too long, and the cold made even the fire reluctant, medieval families turned to habits, small ones, not out of luxury, but because repetition kept the mind from wandering too far into worry. One such habit was the making of snow charms, tiny figures molded from bread dough, shaped into suns, deer, or flowers. They weren't baked, just left by the fire to dry, sometimes painted with soot or berry juice. They were placed near doorways or under beds, meant to remind the household that spring would return. In the Alps, families hung old iron keys above their hearth. These weren't for any actual doors. They were said to lock in warmth, a bit of homegrown magic passed down through the generations. Some households practiced a quiet tradition called the ember count. At the end of each night, they'd count how many glowing embers were still alive in the fire. If the number was high, it meant the household had been generous or kind that day. If low, perhaps they'd been selfish or bitter. It wasn't serious, just something whispered, a little game to give the fire meaning. When fingers were too cold to work cloth and the sun had long disappeared, families played simple games. Most involved little movement, riddles, memory verses, or a game where one person described something from summer, the taste of a plum, the feel of river water, and others guessed what it was. It sounds strange now, but when you haven't seen green grass in 2 months, just hearing the word meadow can feel like sunlight. In some villages, people shared dreams in the mornings, not in journals or sermons, just aloud, over stew or bread crusts. There was a belief that winter dreams were different, that the cold thinned the barrier between the living and the divine, that a dream of a bright bird or a cracked tree had meaning, not prophecy necessarily, but message. A child might say, "I dreamed we cooked eggs in a copper pan," and the elder might nod and say, "That means peace is nearby." Was it true? No one knew, but it was comforting. Another practice, especially among the elderly, was called window walking. They would slowly walk the inside perimeter of their homes at dusk, touching walls, checking corners, not looking for danger, just remembering. They would whisper old names, children who had grown and gone, neighbors long buried, and it was believed that doing this once a week kept the house awake, that a watched home stayed stronger through the frost. There's even a record of one village in eastern France that held a midwinter ritual called the listening bowl. Families would fill a wooden bowl with melted snow and place it in the center of the room. Then they would sit in silence and listen, not to the bowl, but to the house around them. The creak of beams, the crack of the fire, the wind clawing at the shutters. This went on for 1 hour, and at the end, they poured the water out into the snow and said, "Now the silence has been fed." No one's quite sure what it meant, but the point was never logic. The point was ritual, because sometimes, when everything outside is frozen and empty, the only way to keep warm is to fill the silence with meaning. In monasteries, winter brought both hardship and ritual. Monks kept strict hours, even in snow. They prayed before dawn, wearing layers of rough wool robes, and slept in unheated stone dormitories. It was said that enduring the cold built discipline, a test of the spirit as much as the body. One monk in the 12th century wrote, "We sleep as the cattle do, close and low, but the Lord warms those who serve." They believed warmth came not from fire, but from faith. In rural villages, some children were told stories of the winter hag, a folklore figure who roamed the snow looking for lazy sleepers. If you didn't help gather wood or tend the fire, she'd sneak in and steal the warmth from your bed. So children rose early, helped carry logs, and took turns feeding embers through the night. Another tale from the Alps spoke of a spirit called Berkta, who would visit homes between Christmas and Epiphany. If the house was clean and the hearth was warm, she'd leave a coin or blessing. If not, she might turn your stew sour or leave frost on the inside of your walls. Even architecture changed to meet winter's challenge. Homes were built low to the ground, sometimes partially dug into earth. Roofs were steep to let snow slide off. Entrances were narrow and low, designed to trap warm air and block wind. Some towns used shared fire pits in the center of the square, especially during festivals or long nights. People gathered in layers, sang songs, passed around warm drinks, and huddled not just for warmth, but for something else: company. There's a kind of heat that only comes from being together. And when people couldn't gather, they told stories. Storytelling was a kind of winter survival, not for the body, but for the mind. When nights stretched 12, even 14 hours, the firelight became a stage. People recited folk tales, family legends, or verses from memory. Many couldn't read, but they remembered. A grandmother's tale about a snow-covered wolf, a rhyme to keep the fire burning, a song about spring, meant to remind everyone that warmth would return, eventually. There was comfort in repetition, in the rhythm of a story you'd heard 100 times, because it didn't change, even when everything outside did. Some households kept a winter book, not a literal book, but a set of tales told only during the cold months. Tales of buried treasure, frozen lakes that whispered, silent forests that watched you back. Frightening, yes, but somehow cozy too, because they gave shape to the dark. In the far north, Sami herders passed down legends of reindeer that could smell snow before it fell, and spirits that hid inside snowdrifts waiting to blow out lanterns in the night. One story told of a woman who lost her way in a blizzard, only to find herself guided home by a fox with fire in its fur. It was said that if you ever saw that fox, warmth was near, whether by fire or sunrise. The harshest winters didn't always take people in dramatic ways, not in blizzards or snowstorms, but slowly, quietly. A cracked wall, a fire that burned out too soon, a frostbitten toe that turned black. And still people pushed through. They had no thermometers, no warnings, only instinct, and the quiet creak of wood as the temperature dropped another degree. Yet, they survived. Through sharing, through rituals, through habit. There was a rhythm to winter, the gathering of wood, the stirring of stew, the mending of cloaks by dim candlelight. And maybe that's what made it bearable. Not comfort, but connection. To each other, to the seasons, to the quiet understanding that they were part of something older and colder than themselves. And even now, if you listen closely on a winter night, when the wind rattles the window pane and the heat hums through the vent, you can almost hear the echo of that distant world, a world of wool and fire and breath in the dark. So tonight, be thankful for blankets, for thick socks, for radiators and warm drinks and roofs that don't leak. And as you drift off to sleep, imagine the flicker of a medieval hearth, the soft creak of straw under linen, and the knowledge that, for now, you are warm and safe and far from the winter of the past. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with what you'd like to hear next. Good night.